Hello, I'm Yuri Belsky. Today we will learn a heuristic of resources. Dictionaries define resources as people, materials, money, and other objects that can be used by a person, team or company in order to achieve their goals. This definition suggests that we can think of resources as of the treasures that can help us to solve problems more effectively. Research evidence indicates that the way novices approach problems vastly differs from the approach taken by experts. It has been found that novices do not look around to find more information about the situation prior to generating solution ideas. Instead, they try to solve problems they have in one jump. Experts' behavior is very different. When experts face a task, they usually devote significant time to comprehending the problem and to establishing the hidden treasures that they can use to solve the problem effectively. The heuristic of resources that we will learn today can help a novice to systematically search for the available means to solve problems, search for hidden treasures. The heuristic subdivides these hidden treasures into 7 separate groups. Here are the names of these 7 different treasures: substance resources, energy resources, field or information resources, space resources, time resources, function resources, and systems resources. To use the resources heuristic effectively, it is imperative to understand the problem that requires resolution. Also, it is important to note that the resources that belong to each of the 7 groups must be properly recorded. If we will not record them on paper or in electronic document, we may soon forget of many hidden treasures that we have already discovered. Once all the resources have been listed, it is required to look at each of them and to think of its suitability to solve the problem. Let us illustrate how to establish these hidden treasures on a real example of development of a mobile crash barrier by a Singaporean company. Crash barrier, or in professional terminology anti-ram vehicle barrier, is the means to ensure that vehicles that are not allowed to enter certain premises could not enter. The photo in this slide shows how such crash barrier works. In the main photo, with an orange warning light, you can see a raised blocking plate. It is painted in light gray and is connected to a warning plate with yellow and black stripes painted on it. When the blocking plate is raised, it prevents cars from entry. A small insert in the right bottom part of the photo illustrates the position of a blocking plate when a vehicle is permitted to enter. The blocking plate in this image has been lowered and the vehicle can enter the premises freely. The next 2 photographs demonstrate what happens when an intruding vehicle tries to enter premises. The damage to the stopped vehicle looks significant, isn't it? The crash barriers shown in these photos are stationary. They have been installed permanently. A crash barrier that will be used in our illustration of the procedure of the resources heuristic is mobile. Some years ago, a group of engineers from a Singaporean company was developing a barrier that could be transported from place to place and installed for short periods of time where and when required. They hoped to win a tender to build such barriers that was announced by the Singapore government. Well, the mobile barrier development team had many problems to solve. One of the problems was related to additional power that was necessary to operate the blocking plate for the number of cycles that was required by the tender specifications. Allowed battery power could not cover even half of the power needs. Let us see how the heuristic of resources enabled the design team to establish the hidden treasures that delivered additional power to operate the barrier. The first group of hidden treasures is substance resources. These resources cover any available material within the system or systems surrounding. You may stop me here and ask me a question. How could we know what materials are available when a mobile crash barrier hasn't yet even been developed? Well, different strategies can be used for a situation when we try to improve an existing system and when we develop an entirely new system. When we are involved in improvement of an existing system, the way of establishing the hidden treasures is straightforward. We search for them looking at this existing system. In case we develop a novel artifact that doesn't exist yet, it is recommended to search for its hidden treasures studying an existing system that performs similar main useful function to the system we develop. The mobile crash barrier doesn't exist yet, so we will establish the 7 groups of resources for a stationary crash barrier. Okay, if we looked at the existing crash barrier, we can list the following resources. Crash barrier itself, that includes its elements and subsystems, intruding vehicle, vehicles permitted to pass a road where the barrier will be installed, TRIZ and road signs, operators, terrorists, other passengers. It would be great if we were able to list more resources for our specific situation. The goal of this video is to show the heuristics procedure, so we will not explore substance resources any longer and will move to the next group. Energy resources. Energy resources incorporate any sources of energy that exist in the system and its environment. Some of these energy resources are listed in this slide. Some expert problem solvers shared with me that in order to establish as many hidden treasures as possible, they try to visualize themselves inside the system and also imagine themselves walking around the system. This strategy helped many experts to comprehensively investigate available resources. You may try using their strategy too. The next group of resources are information resources. Information resources include any information that can be obtained about the system and its performance. It is recommended to search for the information resources using the 8 fields of MATCAMEP. MATCAMEP is an acronym for the fields of mechanical, acoustic, chemical, electrical, magnetic, intermolecular and biological. In order to familiarize yourself with these fields, you may consider watching a short video on the heuristic of the fields of MATCAMEP. You will find it at the TRIZ repository at www.edisons21.com. Some of the information resources are listed in this slide. These treasures can help, for example, to recognize whether a system performs properly and when it requires urgent maintenance. The next group of resources are time resources. When we look for time resources, we try to establish any unoccupied time slots in system operation, time when the system is inactive, time that can be used for some additional operations, and so on and so forth. This slide presents a list of some of the time treasures that have been identified for the mobile crash barrier. Although the existing stationary crash barrier was considered by the project team to identify the resources, they were able to list some time resources that were specific to the mobile crash barrier. Space resources. Similarly to time resources, when we look for the space resources, we try to identify any unused space in the system and its environment, the space that can be occupied by some additional elements. When we look for resources, it is recommended to be as specific as possible. You may have noticed that the last item of resources listed in this slide, space between individual crash barrier components, is unspecific. It would be more appropriate to list specific empty spaces, for example, space between the raised blocking plate and the body of the barrier, instead of being unspecific. The next group is function resources. The first 5 groups of resources that we have introduced so far are easy to comprehend. They deal with day-to-day things that can be looked at as substance, energy, information, time and space. The last 2 groups of resources require additional explanation. The 6th group of hidden treasures is known as function resources. Resources of this group cover operations that are performed by the system in order to fulfill its main useful function. In essence, We try to identify all these operations in order to see whether they can be used to fulfill additional functions. In our case, the main useful function of the crash barrier is to prevent intruders from entering certain sites. In order to perform this main useful function, the crash barrier needs to at least perform the three sets of operations that are shown in this slide. First, operations related to transformation and installation of the barrier. Second, operations of lowering and raising the blocking plate, and operations related with collection and storage of energy. As it had been mentioned before, a specialist recording resources is expected to list specific resources, rather than to generalize them. In case of the function resources shown in this slide, it would be more appropriate to list individual operations that are included into the above-mentioned set of operations in general. The last group of resources is related to the treasures that can be identified in the superior system, the system that the product under development or improvement is an element of. In order to identify the superior system, it is often sufficient to establish the system that the product we develop delivers the main useful function to. Obviously, the crash barrier delivers the main useful function to a defense or security system that protects residents and property. Therefore, numerous elements of this defense or security system can be looked at as hidden treasures for our purposes. Some of these resources are shown in this slide. We have just finished cataloging the resources of the mobile crash barrier, the hidden treasures that could be deployed to enhance its operations. Let us see how these resources were used by the design team from Singapore to achieve required power specification for raising and lowering the blocking plate. You remember, the allowed battery was only sufficient for less than half of the cycles, and the team was looking for resources that could help in getting more power. You may recall that amongst all resources identified during our learning exercise, we have listed substance resources of crash barrier itself and the vehicles permitted to enter, and energy resources of gravitation and hydraulic power. Considering these resources, the team came up with a solution similar to that, according to some historians at least, the famous inventor Thomas Alva Edison deployed in his home to pump water. Visitors to Edison's home noticed that the gate to his home was very difficult to open. Most of them thought that the gate needed fixing. They were very polite, though, and didn't mention it to Edison. Actually, as some friends of Edison revealed, the gate didn't need repairs. Edison simply attached a pump to his gate, so that every time a visitor opened or closed it, fresh water was pumped into the plumbing system of his house. Similarly to Edison, who used visitors pushing the gates to pump water, the design team used the vehicles that were allowed to drive over the crash barrier, as well as the resources of the existing hydraulic system that were already in use. You see the barrier developed by the team of engineers from Singapore in this slide. In order for their energy collecting system to work, engineers have added hydraulic pump on both sides of the barrier and a hydraulic accumulator that collected the energy pumped by the entering and leaving vehicles. When engineers listed all the resources, they started asking themselves whether these resources can help in boosting power storage. And surprise, surprise, they were able to identify suitable resources amongst the treasures that they have already listed with help of the resources heuristic. We have just learned how to systematically establish hidden treasures that may help in solving problems we face. Let us ask ourselves why and how this resources heuristic helps a practitioner. Normally, our assessment of available treasures is erratic. We do not usually make any systematic effort to establish the resources available. Therefore, we normally have a messy picture of what is at hand. We can illustrate such lack of order as a set of boxes of important stuff that we will need in the future, stored by us in a garage in a rush. If you ever tried to find anything in such chaotic storage, you know that the outcome is usually time wasted. The heuristic of resources engages us in systematic storage of resources, and when treasures are stored systematically, it is easy to find the resource that can help. Well, today you've learned how to systematically search for resources that can help you to solve problems you face. As soon as your problem is clear, you need to record the hidden treasures that belong to 7 groups: substance, energy, information, space, time, function, and system. Then you ask yourself whether any of these treasures can help you in achieving your goal. Start using this heuristic. You will soon discover that the problems that looked extremely difficult are not that difficult at all. Moreover, regularly using the resources heuristic will also help you in gaining expert skills in comprehending problems and in establishing the hidden treasures that help to solve problems expertly. Consider studying more heuristics from the Edisons21.com repository.